Welcome to this presentation of Seven Mountains. In this presentation, I first of all want to give you a general overview of the situation regarding the refugees. Secondly, we want to look at what are some of the biblical principles that should be applied in this situation. And thirdly, what are some of the implications if we would do this? So let's have a look at the map of the Middle East. Here we see the dark green area is Syria, above it Turkey. Turkey is from east to west about 1600 kilometers and from south to north almost 800. So it's a long way to travel all the way to the EU from Syria. Iraq is here, Iran next to it. Of course, here we have Lebanon, Egypt, and not too far south there is Saudi Arabia and the other South Gulf states. So what is the history of this conflict? First of all, it started in 2011 when initially a peaceful revolt started against President Assad, which then in 2012 actually became violent and turned into the war that we know as it is today. But actually there are far more parties involved than that, so let's have a look at the map. As you can see here, there are several groupings involved in the conflict. Mixed rebels, jihadists, the rebel army that initially started to fight against the Assad regime itself, Hezbollah, the Islamic State or ISIS. This is the area where Israel is trying to hold off the conflict, and the Kurdish conflict that up in the north. So as you see over time here, from March 2014 to September 2015, you can see the shift in and the control that ISIS has taken over the whole nation. See how it changes here, and the gray area becomes bigger and bigger and taking more and more control of Syria. So who are the Syrian refugees? These are statistics on this page that show that more than 4 million refugees have been registered with the UNHCR. And if we look at the demography of the refugees, it's about 50% are male and 50% are female. This is a breakdown by age group, and if you add this up, you realize that about 50% of the total refugees are below or less than 18 years of age, so from 0 to 17 years, and the rest are the other 50% are just older. So 50% really are children, and this is according to the UNHCR that has registered all the refugees.
I am Professor Hans Rosling. Let me show you where the Syrian refugees are today. Before this very tragic conflict started, there were around 20 million people living in Syria. Each block here represents 1 million people. Today, more than half of that population, 12 million, have left their homes. 8 million have fled to other parts of Syria. They are often referred to as internally displaced people. 4 million live as refugees in the neighboring countries. It's mainly Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Now, how many has made it to the European Union? It's only 250,000. 250,000 Syrian refugees that have applied for asylum in the European Union. This is less than 2% of the total number of internal and external refugees from Syria. In Syria, the tragic conflict is intensifying. Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, recently took control of one more city, so the number of refugees will increase. The Syrian refugees are not allowed to apply for asylum in the embassies of the EU countries in this region. But if they find a way to travel to an EU country, then inside the country they are allowed to apply, and they will also be granted asylum today because the situation is so terrible in Syria. But in order to exercise that right, they have to enter the EU illegally through costly and dangerous journeys. But presently the European Union is discussing a quota plan that will enable refugees of different origin that live outside Europe to apply for asylum before coming, and that will secure safe travels. But the plan only includes 20,000 refugees. So even if applied only to the Syrian refugees, it will just cover 0.2%, that is 1 in 500. So today the European Union does everything it can to stop more than 99% of the Syrian refugees to apply for the asylum that they are legally entitled to in EU countries.
At the moment, most of the refugees are coming here from the east, as we can see, through Greece and trying to come this way through Hungary into the EU. There's a second route, it's from Central Africa, and here the Western African route. As we can see, 250,000 refugees are coming into Europe at the moment, topping up a population of 500 million. So if we look at what effect that really has, it means that 0.05% increase of population. As Professor Rosling said, already 1.8 million refugees are in Turkey. Iraq has taken in almost 250,000. Lebanon, 1.2 million. Jordan has taken in over 600,000. Egypt, 133,000. But the question that remains as well is, if we look at further south, the real Muslim states, countries as well, Saudi Arabia has taken in 0 refugees, and the same applies to all the rich Gulf states as well. Kuwait, 0, Qatar. None of these states have taken in any refugees. This is an article that was published in the New Delhi paper. I'll read it to you in English and you can read along in Slovak if you want to. Reports indicate that Saudi Arabia has offered to build 200 mosques in Germany to help the growing number of people fleeing the conflict in West Asia. According to the German publication Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which quoted a report in the Lebanese newspaper Al Diyar, Saudi Arabia will build 1 mosque for every 100 refugees who entered Germany in extraordinary numbers last weekend. The Gulf states have received a fair amount of criticism for failing to do enough to resettle the growing number of refugees from West Asia. As Amnesty International points out, 6 Gulf countries, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, have offered 0 resettlement places to Syrian refugees. So let's look at another video clip, approaching the whole subject from quite a different angle. Mind you, this is from an American perspective, but some of the principles might be true in our context.
Some people say that mass immigration into the United States can help reduce world poverty. Is that true? Well, no, it's not. And let me show you why. This gumball represents the 1 million legal immigrants that the United States has taken every year on average since 1990. Now, who in the world deserves our humanitarian compassion? The World Bank has one measure of the desperately poor of the world. They make less than $2 a day. And how many people make less than $2 a day in the world? Well, let's start with Africa. In Africa alone, there are 650 million people who make less than $2 a day. 650 million. And in India, another 890 million people, desperately poor. China adds another 480 million people, making less than $2 a day. And unfortunately, the rest of Asia has a heartbreaking 810 million people who the World Bank says make less than $2 a day. And finally, there's 105 million of Latin America's population that are desperately poor. All told, the World Bank says there are 3 billion people in the world, 3 billion people who are desperately poor, making less than $2 a day. That's 3,000 gumballs. And every year, we take 1 million and suggest that we've somehow made a humanitarian difference? Of course, we don't pull our immigrants from these desperately poor populations, do we? These people are too poor, too sick, too disconnected to make it here as immigrants. We tend to pull our immigrants out of the better off poor of the world, and Mexico tends to define the type of immigrant that we bring here because the plurality of people come from Mexico. And Mexico is poor. How many people in the world live in countries that have average incomes lower than that of Mexico? And the World Bank tells us that that number is these 3 billion plus another 2.6 billion people. 5.6 billion people in the world who live in countries with average incomes below that of Mexico. That's 5,600 gumballs. And so what is it that the elites are telling us? They're telling us that when we take this 1 million immigrants, that we somehow or another are tackling world poverty. And we have to do it regardless of the effect on our unemployed, the working poor, the most vulnerable members of our society, regardless of the effect on our natural resources. Even if we went by the most radical proposals in Washington, which are to actually double our immigration to 2 million a year, which would totally overwhelm our physical, natural, and social infrastructures, we couldn't make a noticeable difference. And we may be really hurting the impoverished people of the world because the million that we do take are among the most energetic, often the better educated, certainly the most dissatisfied people that if they did not immigrate would be the agents for change to improve the lot of all the people in these countries. The true heroes in the global humanitarian field are the people in these countries who have the wherewithal to immigrate to another country, but instead stay in their countries to apply their skills to help their fellow countrymen. Unfortunately, our immigration system tends to entice these very type of people to abandon their countrymen. The impossibility of making even a dent is actually worse than it looks here, because last year, when we took 1 million immigrants, these countries added, births over deaths, 80 million more people into the impoverished populations. And this year, Congress is bringing in 1 million legal immigrants. And this year, according to the United Nations, these countries are expected to add another 80 million people. And next year, you can be quite sure that Congress, unless stopped by the American voters, will bring in another 1 million immigrants. And these countries, unfortunately, will be adding another 80 million people into these impoverished nations. We could take 5 million a year, but we'd never get ahead of what's happening in these countries. Not in this century. Don't you see? Immigration can never be an effective or significant way to deal with the suffering people of the world. They have to be helped where they live. 99.9% of them will never be able to immigrate to a rich country. There's no hope for that. They have to bloom where they're planted. The only place that 99.9% of these people can be helped is where they live. Let's help them there.
This is a letter I received from a Christian leader a while back. I'll read it again in English, as you can see the subtitles. I was hungry and you threw food at me like I was an animal in the zoo. I was a stranger and you erected a 175-kilometer razor wire barrier to keep me out. I was thirsty, sick, and needed fresh clothes, and you treated me with 3 years in prison if I crossed the border illegally, and 5 years if I damaged the fence. "But Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" You don't mean those Muslims, surely? Truly I tell you, whatever you did not for me, for one of the least of these, you did not for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Strong words, but they are based on Jesus' unambiguous statements in Matthew 25 and have total relevance for us in Europe today. The irony is that some of our leaders, like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, justify a hardline approach against asylum seekers as necessary to preserve Europe as a Christian continent. Others, like Angela Merkel, argue that Europe's core Christian identity will only be preserved by acts of Christian compassion, not by exclusion, confrontation, and rejection. So let's go to the second part of this presentation. What are some of the biblical principles we should apply in this situation regarding refugees? First of all, let's look at this picture. This is the picture that brought the whole refugee problem into the headlines of the media. Some people say it's a Photoshop picture, but I think it's a very graphic picture of a little child that has been washed ashore in Turkey. So these are some of the biblical principles. First of all, it's important to understand that in the Old Testament there are three words used to describe the stranger, the foreigner, and the sojourner. Sometimes a combination of both words are being used in the same sentence. So let's look at Leviticus 19, for instance. It says, "The foreigner who resides with you must be to you like a native citizen among you. So you must love him as yourself, because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." And so the Lord here is making a reference to the situation that the Israelites had been in themselves, and therefore needed to have compassion with people that were displaced. And again, in Deuteronomy 10 it says, "He executes justice for the orphan and the widows. Love the foreigner and gives them food and clothing. You are to love the foreigner because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt." It's very clear. This is one side of the picture. But then the other side is, in Exodus 12 for instance, "One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourns with you," or among you. So in other words, the laws of the country should be the same for both the people that live in the country and the foreigners that come in. So there is not to be set up any different system, but they are to submit to the local system. And again in Leviticus 24:2, "You shall have one kind of law for the foreigner as well as the native born, for I am Yahweh your God." And then in Leviticus 18, actually it's a very strong passage. It says, "Do not defile yourself with any of these things, for the nations which I am about to drive out before you have been defiled with all these things. Therefore the land has become unclean, and I have brought the punishment of its iniquity upon it, so that the land has vomited out its inhabitants. You yourself must obey my statutes and my regulations, and must not do any of these abominations, both the native citizen and the resident foreigner in your midst. For the people who were in the land before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become unclean. So do not make the land vomit you out, because you defile it, just as it has vomited out the nations that were before you." So in other words, this scripture is saying that, again, an emphasis on that the people that live in the land and the people that are residents or become long-term residents within the nation, they are to submit to the laws of the land. Which brings us to the third part of our presentation. If these are God's laws, God's principles to form society, that on the one hand we should welcome the refugees with open arms, yet at the same time we require of them that they submit to the laws, to the culture of our country, what does that mean in practice? Because Slovakia is a democracy, and democracy in principle is a Christian idea as well. So if we look at Slovakia, how are the laws formed in a country? It's by representation in parliament. So people are voting all over the country to bring people into parliament, like we will have this next year coming up. And together they form the parliament. And so the parliament will be made up out of humanists, Christians, and if we allow Muslims to come into the country, eventually a very small minority can come into parliament as well. And together they create the laws of the country. If I look at the Slovak parliament as it is today, the majority of them are humanists. And consequently, the laws that they produce are humanistic in nature. Now, what that really means, we will discuss in the next presentation. But if we want this nation to become truly Christian, then for sure, what is needed is that more and more Christians get involved into politics, therefore make themselves electable for parliament, and bring in the Christian values and culture that we have known from the past Slovakia to be.